between the well-paid and the moderately or less well and low-paid. 54%. Let's see. This is a distribution of income from 67 to 87. The top 30% of the workforce, and basically 30% of the American public goes to college, 70% does not. The 30%, and this is by and large correlates with college education, used to control 54% of the income, and it's now 58. And the bottom 70% has dropped from 46 to 42. The disparity between professional and managerial on the one hand and high-skilled workers was like 3 or 4% 20 years ago. Today it's in the range of 20%. And so we've got a widening disparity of income, and that exacerbates our problem. We used to have the highest level of income in the world. Today there are 13 nations that pay higher wages to their workers in real terms, adjusted for currency fluctuations, etc. The standards of living for the average worker in 13 countries is now higher than the United States. The relative wages of frontline workers are going down. This is the point I was making earlier. Professional and technical, 72 to 87. The change in wages, they were at 100% of each other. Professional and technical is the standard, I'm sorry. Craft workers used to make 98% of technical and professional, now they make 73%. Clerical workers, I can't read it, 69, and what is the next number, the black? 54. So the point is, there's wider disparity, and the craft, the clerical, the laborers, those peoples are making relatively less than professional and technical as compared to 20 years ago, increasing that disparity. This is the point about the production lines that I made a little earlier. The reason that the production line, the Henry Ford or the Tayloristic model, is no longer efficient in an era of high differentiation of product models and very rapid change of products is that it requires many layers of supervision. And the faster you change and the more different models you produce, the more supervisors or indirect workers are required. Factories now have on average 3 or 4 indirect workers for every direct worker. When production is organized in a production line, you need somebody to maintain the machines. I mean, the worker who's there, who got trained in a half hour to put that nut on that bolt, he doesn't know how to set up the machine and fix it when it's broken. He doesn't do anything about scheduling the nuts and the bolts that flow to him. Somebody else does that. He doesn't check the quality of his own work. He doesn't do the maintenance on the machines to prevent it from breaking down. On and on. There are more and more levels of indirect workers supporting that person. The ways in which factories are organized abroad, requiring high-skilled workers, not people with 8th grade educations, is they work as a team. And you've all heard about the Japanese team concept, where the workers get together and discuss the problems. How can we make this process more efficient? How can I hand it off from here to there? I saw a Volvo factory in Sweden where they work as teams. Part of the time they were assembling. This particular factory was making seats. Half the day they can be assembling, and then they switch to avoid the boredom, and they become pickers, taking the parts out of the warehouse by forklift and bringing it over. They schedule their own work. Somebody wants to go to school, the team decides, okay, Janie for the next 6 weeks, Janie won't be here from 4 to 7 in the evening or whatever the time is, from 2 to 5, and we'll fill in for her. We'll find somebody else. They schedule their own work, they schedule their own parts, they assemble it, they do their own quality control. It's much more interesting and it's much more efficient because all those levels of supervision are gone. The workers are self-supervising, self-selecting, self-directing. And as a result, costs are lower because they don't have all these indirect layers. Okay. And this really makes the point I was just making. There's the support to the frontline workers in the new work organization. In the old one, it's the other way around. Now, we do the worst job in the world, in the industrialized world, of preparing our frontline workers. This chart shows algebra results for 17-year-olds. The percentage of the population taking the course is the horizontal scale, and the vertical is the percent that do it properly. In Japan, roughly the same percentage, 10 or 12% take algebra, as in the United States. But look where we rank. We rank down there with Hungary in terms of the results. That's a telling chart. United Kingdom, Finland, Belgium, Sweden, Austria, all do better than we do. And on math, as most of you know, the Koreans are reported to have the best math results of anybody in the world. Not, I believe, because they're any smarter than American kids, but because the way the school system is organized and the school-to-work transition. Okay. Now, the problems with our schools, I'm sure what's here is very similar to things that Joe Spagnola talked about this morning. Tracking and low expectations for the non-college bound. And I heard some of that in one of these seminars that in York County, with the assistance of the Southern Educational Conference, an experiment is going on to eliminate or reduce that tracking and have high expectations for everybody, whether you're going to be a car mechanic or a waitress or a high-tech worker at NASA. Same expectations. This is true in Europe. It's true in Japan. The slower people, kids that don't learn as fast in Japan, the difference is they don't track them, that you have to learn less. They expect them to go to school longer. So a slower learning student in Japan goes on Saturdays. And if he doesn't, and he takes home more homework. And if he doesn't, they already have lots of homework, but he takes home more. And then he goes on Saturdays. And if he doesn't get it in 6 days, he goes over the summer. But by the following fall, every Japanese kid, I mean virtually, 95% or 98%, is ready to go into the next grade. Not because he has a social promotion, but because the society expects it and assists him to master that material so that he is truly prepared. Gifted kids learn faster, but everybody in Japan is expected through the age of 16 to master that basic material. We have, as I don't have to elaborate this, problems with the poor, and I know Joe spoke about preparing our children to enter school, particularly children from underprivileged and low-income families. More than 90%, we have no standards. More than 90% of employers view a high school diploma as having little educational value. Dropping out is permissible in our society. It's not permissible elsewhere. I mean, sure, the Germans have their dropouts and the Swedes have their dropouts, but they have an active outreach program to bring these kids back into the system. Now, they don't bring them back necessarily to the same school they dropped out of and repeat the failure. They have alternative learning environments. They have environments which are informal, which don't have, benches or seats in the classroom and the normal tables and chairs and a blackboard. It may be computerized learning, or it may be learning, what we would call a CCC kind of camp. In other words, they take them into the woods. They might work during the day, take some courses in the afternoon or the evening, but it's an informal environment particularly suited to kids that can't make it in the traditional sit-down, chalkboard and classroom environment. Unequal access to resources for the rich and poor, and we have undoubtedly the worst school-to-work transition of any country in the world. Everybody else, every other society, industrialized society, has an organized way to assist kids to getting from education into the workforce. The Germans probably have the most elaborate, the most complicated, but also one of the best known. It's an apprenticeship program. You've all heard of the German apprenticeship system. It's applicable to virtually every occupation. You could not In our country, as you know, apprenticeship is primarily limited to the building trades. In Germany, if you're going into the banking business, into the insurance business, into the retail trades, you want to be a hairdresser or a waitress, a hotel worker of any kind, a chef, or a cook or a dining room worker. There's an apprenticeship program. The program is defined by business and labor and the government. In each case, that tripartite, they call it a tripartite system, decides what it is that a cook should know. What is it that a hairdresser or a taxi cab driver or an industrial technician or a bank clerk needs to know, or a retail clerk? That is described, and from the age of 16 to either 18 or 20, every German youth spends 3 or 4 days a week in a working environment, and a day or 2, sometimes 3 days a week, in a classroom environment, but the classroom training, as in our community colleges, is directly oriented to what the child is learning or doing, so that obviously the mathematics that somebody going in the banking business needs to know is different than the mathematics that somebody's going to be a carpenter. One would emphasize arithmetic and statistics and algebra, and the other geometry. So that the math or the English, or in that case the German, the language, is focused on and is related to what the student's going to learn. Now, other countries have somewhat different systems, but all of them have far better programs than we do of linking school to work, so that what the kid learns he sees is relevant to what he's going to do or what he is doing in this working experience. And obviously a motivating factor. We don't do any of that. Okay. Now, briefly, our recommendations. The first recommendation is to establish the certificate of initial mastery, a high performance standard to be met by age 18, and that recommendation was seconded by the Virginia Commission, which Bob referred, and I'm sure Joe Spagnola spoke about. It will be benchmarked, not to Illinois, not to North Carolina, not to West Virginia. It'll be benchmarked to Germany, Sweden, and Japan. That's who we have to compete with. And until we recognize that and focus on that, that first chart is going to continue to happen. Our standards of living will go down. Because the President has called for a national assessment system, and one of the important points here is this assessment system would not be a typical paper and pencil test, and it wouldn't be done as in Japan over a day or two and the testing hell. The recommendation is we do it in an American fashion over a period of years, more like the merit badge of the Scout system, so that you would demonstrate your proficiency at various ages, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, etc., in various subjects: history, geography, math, science, English. And you would do it with portfolios. You'd have an examination. You might have to stand up, and as Ted Sizers recommends, and is demonstrated in many places, that the kid can best show what he knows by standing up in the classroom and telling other children what he knows, not by sitting at a desk privately filling in machine scorable tests. So it's a test that could be oriented in every state and every locality to be equal and fair to minorities and ethnic minorities of all kinds, so that it would eliminate the kind of bias that exists in existing testing systems. Okay. Second recommendation is that for those who don't make it, that we have a dropout recovery system, a youth center, somewhat like I talked about that they have in Sweden. That kids who don't make it in school, whether it's for academic reasons, personal reasons, family reasons, health reasons, whatever, would have an alternative learning environment. Now, we recommend a stick as well as a carrot here. One of, I think, the problems of American education is that there really is not much incentive for a 16-year-old to stay in school. He can drop out, go work at McDonald's, make his $4 an hour, buy a car, impress his girlfriend or her boyfriend, buy fancy sneakers and jewelry and all that other stuff. And all of that's more important to kids because they don't see the relevance of staying in school and mastering algebra or English or whatever. And we allow it, we encourage it. What we're recommending is if you're not in school, and West Virginia said if you're not in school, you can't get a driver's license. We're recommending for Virginia, and the Virginia Commission recommends this, and for the country, that if you're 16 and drop out of school, you cannot work until you're age 18. You cannot get an exemption to child labor laws unless you're enrolled in one of these youth centers. Now, you could work at McDonald's provided, and we haven't specified the number of hours, but 10 or 15 hours a week. In the evenings, Saturdays, whatever, you come to the youth center. And there, this youth center would deal with some of your emotional problems or your family problems, your personal problems, but would also require you to continue working for your certificate of mastery. So there would be an important informal educational component that while you were working, you would still be pursuing this certificate. And we think that's a critical factor, motivating factor. Okay, moving quickly, we should create 2 to 4 year professional technical training programs with industry-defined standards. And a lot of that is happening, right here at Thomas Nelson. Apprenticeship certificates or training, or certifications, technical certifications, certifying as they do in Germany, that you're a certified plumber or bank clerk or electrician or whatever. It dignifies the work that non-college bound kids perform, gives them status, and it gives the employers a validation that the kids have mastered the material that the employers have had a major say in defining as necessary for that particular skill or occupation. Fourth recommendation, employers should be encouraged to invest in the education and training of their existing workers. 92% of the workers in the year 2000 are already on the job. And if this country is going to pull itself up by its boots, in the year 2000, we can not only focus on those that are entering the workforce, but by far the overwhelming number of those in the workforce in the year 2000 are there today. And we called for a tax, basically, that every employer would have to invest 1 or 1.5% of payroll on training all of his workers, not just the professionals and the data processing people and the managers, and because American business does a pretty good job of that, but also invest in training and upgrading the skills of the frontline workers in proportion to their prevalence in the workforce, and that 1.5% needs to be spent on that. If you spend it, you deduct it from your tax return. If you don't spend it, you pay the tax in full, and that goes into a fund which would be used to finance on-the-job training for those employers who, for whatever reason, and it may be some legitimate reasons, a dry cleaner with 3 or 4 employees may not be able to run a training program, but yet his workers, their skills need to be upgraded too, both for their existing jobs and for future jobs. Okay. The recommendations ends up in a chart which shows, and we have a very similar chart in the Virginia report that basically shows that kids move from elementary school, get to through secondary school or technical options, to college or into the workforce, that basically at the age of 16, a kid has 3 options. He can go to work if he's got a certificate of initial mastery. He can get a technical certificate at a junior college or community college, or he can continue college preparation and go to college. And we believe the system needs to be very flexible, because not everybody at 16 is ready to make a lifetime commitment. And so those who pick the college route could drop back if they choose and pursue a technical degree. And by the same token, those who pursue a technical degree could switch and use the credits that they've accumulated in that 2 or 4 year interval after 16 to the extent they're relevant and useful. They would be applicable to college, and they would get college credit towards a baccalaureate degree. And by the same token, the system would always be open for the workers who dropped out of an educational system for the after 16 and went into the workforce. They could come back while they were working or at some other time in their career. They'd be 50 years old and get, like a GED, get that certificate of initial mastery that would put them back on the track to pursue a technical professional degree or a college education. That, in a nutshell, is the proposal. The bottom line is in the title of the report: America's Choice, High Skills or Low Wages. Economics, in a competitive world with low tariff barriers, there is no choice. Okay? American business and other businesses are going to go for the greatest productivity. They are to wherever that workforce is that's going to give them the greatest productivity. There are two types of productivity. There's the real cheap, low-wage productivity. Okay, it may not be efficient, but if you're paying 50 cents an hour or 30 cents an hour, as you will in Bangladesh, or 75 cents as in Mexico, businesses that only want the lowest possible cost, whether they're American businesses or foreign businesses, are going to put their plants where those 75-cent workers are. The other choice are jobs that pay $5 and $10 and $20 an hour, and those jobs go only to societies that have highly skilled workers. Obviously, we don't want to compete with the underdeveloped countries in the world to see who can pay the lowest possible wages. We want to compete with Japan and Germany, and France, and Sweden, where they're paying high wages to high-skilled workers. That's what's going to reverse that curve, that chart that I first showed you, so that real incomes after inflation can, in this country, real standards of living can start up again and stop declining. The choice is ours, and I'm delighted that Thomas Nelson, Bob Templin, and all of you in the peninsula here are taking the initiative, and you've taken a lot of initiatives, leading, I believe, this state towards worker development, worker and job reorganization in a way that we can reclaim the high ground for productivity, high skills, and high wages. Thank you. I don't want to trespass on your time, but to the extent that we have a few minutes, and Bob, you tell me when that few minutes is up and you need to resume your regular agenda, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions or comments or whatever that you may have. I'd like to step down just a minute to get a glass of water. The question is, how do labor unions feel about this? I think that's a good question, and it's a serious concern. At one level, I can tell you that the report of the National Commission contained representatives from the AFL, from AFSCME, the American Federation of State and Municipal Employees, from the CIO, and the report was unanimous. The Virginia Commission had a representative of the Virginia AFL-CIO, and he endorsed it. But at one level, there's support. The question is, on the firing line, on the plant floor, what will the reaction of labor unions be? I believe, properly explained, everybody sees it in their interest to increase wages and productivity. Bob was telling me earlier that at the Siemens plant here, that Siemens has reorganized the work with essentially the same workforce that Bendix had, and that the unions are now highly supportive. They were suspicious, but as I understand it, Siemens is paying people based on how much they know, and there's no limit. The more you know, the more productive you can become, and therefore the more you can make. And the unions are now supporting. Is that correct? So I think it has to be properly explained. Change is threatening. Change is threatening to all of us, whether it's in business or education or in labor movement. But if it's what we're talking about is expanding the pie. We have been fighting, in a sense, politically, the haves and the have-nots in this country, and that's basically what political fights are about, is the allocation of society's resources, have been fighting over a shrinking pie. We now need to turn that around and expand the pie. And the only way to expand the pie is to increase productivity in our businesses, in our jobs. And if there's more productivity, then business can afford higher wages. And I think unions understand that. Any other questions?
What do you see the future of a high school diploma?
What is the future of a high school diploma? That's a tough question, and I think we, as you know, we wrestled with that with the commission. The key, as far as I'm concerned, is age 16. He's demonstrating at that age that as a student, you are proficient at world standards in English and math, geography and history, and science. To me, beyond that, a high school diploma is not terribly relevant, except as a social recognition. And I would continue that, I believe, because I think to do away with it would be politically difficult at best, and maybe politically impossible. But I would continue it and make it available to everybody, whichever one of those three options they chose. If they want to go to work, fine. They can stay aligned with their high school, possibly play on the high school football team, basketball team, until they're 18, and graduate not with a high school diploma, but with their class and with some recognition. Clearly, though, those that are pursuing a technical degree or college-bound would continue in their affiliated with their high school, even if they went to a community college or some other place to get that formal education, and could receive, if they qualified, a high school degree, and enable them to continue to participate in the social, athletic, and non-academic aspects of being a high school student, regardless of whether their courses were physically at the high school or someplace else. But that's a controversial subject, and some of you may have very different views on how that should be done. The substance is more important to me than the form. Senator.
Can you go into what is involved in the certificate of measure, what kind of skills you're looking at?
Well, what we're basing it on, it's the key subject matters. I think one of the problems with American high school education, or elementary and high school education, is it spreads itself too thin. Our European counterparts don't do that. It's competency in math, in science, in English, some geography and some history, benchmarked to world-class standards. Now, the other things that prepare people to work productively in the workforce, and there are other skills, I think can be learned from between 16 and 18 in these kind of apprenticeship-oriented or mentorship programs. The social skills of working together, the problem solving as a team, the being work ready, in other words, knowing that you have to show up on time and properly dressed and with the right attitude. Some of that can be done prior to 16, but I think that acculturation to the workplace is probably best done in the interaction with the workplace rather than taught as an academic matter to kids under the age of 16. But again, that's a personal view, and many of you know more about that than I do, and I don't think that's critical to the argument that we're making here. Kids need to know both the substance and the work readiness skills. How they learn it is something that others in this room are much better qualified to answer than I. Okay, thank you very much.
You've heard a number of stirring remarks today from both an educator's perspective and from a business person's perspective. Lest you go away feeling that all of this is a bit overwhelming, I'd like to bring this back to perspective. And that is, while you've seen a national agenda that's being shaped by the Commission report, being reflected in President Bush's report, a nation heading in a direction, so too you see the Commonwealth of Virginia with a clear vision with regard to pathways that are available to us. But let's not forget that many of the seeds from which these ideas sprang were planted right here. Many of the activities that you're engaged in, whether it be in terms of the new concepts of applied math and science, or what it means that early intervention in working with preschoolers, many of those ideas are being experimented with right now in our own schools. The peninsula, believe me, because I've been out across the state over the past 18 months, the peninsula and the work that you're doing is leading the way in Virginia and the nation, and that the efforts that we're making here today, while somewhat cumbersome and sometimes clumsy, will be the models for Virginia and the nation tomorrow. You ought to be proud of the effort that you're in. You are leaders. You are true pioneers. And it's because of your efforts that I'm so excited and hopeful about our future. Mr. Wurzel, if you'd come forward, I'd like to present you with a small token of our appreciation. On behalf of the conference and all those that are here, thank you for being with us today, Alan.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
I hope that you believe that each year these conferences and the themes that we pick become more and more relevant to the work that you're about and to our cooperative effort of creating a single unified education system where the primary beneficiary are our children and our young people and our young adults. Together, our future is very bright indeed. Thank you for being with us. Rex, do you want to bring some closing remarks?
I'll be very brief. We thank you very much for coming to the Articulation Conference today. In your packet of information, there is an evaluation form. We would appreciate you taking just a couple of minutes to fill that out and drop it off at the registration table as you exit today. Let me take time to thank those individuals who agreed to be presenters today, and also our industry partners who came and set up displays and talked with each of you about the Adams Project. If those presenters and industry partners will please stand, I'd like for us to give them a round of applause. I realize that in setting up a conference, it really is not possible without the work and cooperation of a lot of people. So I'd like to ask the Thomas Nelson support staff that helped behind the scenes put the conference together today to please stand and be recognized. As you can tell, they're a very modest group. Again, I thank you for coming to the Articulation Conference today. I hope that you will look forward to next year's conference, and I also hope that you will take home some of these ideas and share them with your colleagues and friends and expand on some of the ideas that were discussed today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.